Well, clearly it states that the lion will lay down with the lamb in heaven. I don't want to say that I don't have a problem with it. Sure, there's some moral feelings that I have where it's, man, God, why do you allow this to happen?
Do you think it's a white male thing to object to the killing of animals?
If torturing animals is not going to convince you that this God is not perfectly good, if commanding genocide is not going to convince you that this God isn't perfectly good, what would?
I have a bigger concern, Alex. I have the concern of my nephew who was born with spina bifida. I have a bigger concern, Alex, and that's my younger sister who was born with brain damage and had to go through special ed.
Of non-human animal suffering before the fall of man. I'm going to underline that. I'm going to quote it again. I'm going to put it in bold. Before the fall of man.
How is it justified to kill the animals of people that say we shouldn't worship God? Tell me what the justification for that is.
Yeah, sure. Alex said the Bible doesn't talk about animals in heaven. Well, clearly it states that the lion will lay down with the lamb in heaven. So who's to say when ultimately animals are swept up, for example, in a bomb in Iraq? I'm sure some squirrels have been swept up in a bomb. Who's to say that that's not justifiable in any sort of way? When we live in a tremendously broken world, you talked about it yourself earlier, over 90% of the suffering we go through is done by humans. So, no, I'm not going to give you I don't want to say that I don't have a problem with it. Sure, there's some moral feelings that I have where it's, man, God, why do you allow this to happen? But you need to come to the conclusion that the most reluctant atheist across the pond where you guys live, named C.S. Lewis, he had the opposite response as you do right now. He talks about animal as well as human suffering, and his moral outrage towards it shows that there is a moral law, that there is justice ultimately that's objective, and that would be from God. Then secondly, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, the great Pulitzer Prize winning author over here, Annie Dillard. Read it yourself. She came to believe in God and then a Christian as well as this huge atheist because of her moral outrage over what she saw mainly with insects in the swamp behind her house that she studied for over a year. When she saw different forms of insects landing on the backs of frogs and slowly sucking their brains out, she didn't have this response that you and Alex did, which is, oh, there could be no God who would allow something like that to happen. No, she had the opposite response. And she said, my moral outrage leads me to believing that there is moral objectivity out there. I have a real issue with it. If there wasn't, I wouldn't have a big issue with it. It's just, this is how nature operates, and I got to be okay with that. So
these animals,
some of the biggest atheists have come, and I follow what they're saying. That makes sense to me. It checks out.
These animals are not swept up like you described with those squirrels. These animals are killed on the command of God. And as you know, we discussed this at some length in our last conversation in 1 Samuel 15. The best of the livestock are kept alive by Saul. And when he approaches Samuel, Samuel informs him that God has said he regretted he made Saul king. Why did God regret that he made Saul king? Because he kept alive the animals that he was supposed to kill. This is not like there is some kind of natural order which requires a balanced ecosystem which will involve predation and this kind of thing. This is God saying, go into this town, kill the men, kill the women, kill the children and the infants, and kill the animals. And when Saul does not kill the animals and leaves some of them alive, God regrets that he made Saul king. Phil's question, I think, is to explain how this kind of command can be justified. Not animals getting swept up as a foreseen but unintended consequence of the natural order or war, but no, go and kill them. And if you don't kill them all, you're going to be punished for it. Why?
Because you have an omniscient, omnipotent God who controls the entire universe, who we have to allow to judge when he so chooses. And
judge the animals?
Have revulsions in our 21st century mindset, especially you being very white male and me being very white male, in a very secular, very prominent intellectual area of the world, we're going to have a revulsion to it. Now, I'm going to go to your earlier argument, Alex. Go over.
Do you think it's a white male thing to object to the killing of animals?
They're going to say, "Who are you, Alex, to say in your white Western culture that there's such a big issue with this?" The majority of people in those areas of the world would say, of course a God who's big enough, who created you, is allowed to judge in a nasty, brutish, ancient Near Eastern culture? What's the big deal? And so this gets back to the malleability of the Bible, how it lifts up some cultures and then at the same time challenges and convicts other cultures, rather than this just consensus, universalistic, fluffy type of text.
But
Do you think that-
Stu, let me hang on. I just want to ask you a question.
ahead,
Right,
Paul.
very simple question. Right, if torturing animals is not something to make you think maybe the character in the Bible is not the perfect God that you think exists, right? Because it could be there is a perfect God, but it's not the God of the Bible, right? That's possible. Would you concede that?
Anything's possible if I'm an agnostic.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, right now, if torturing animals is not going to convince you that this God is not perfectly good, if commanding genocide is not going to convince you that this God isn't perfectly good, what would? Tell me what would convince you, actually, the character in this book isn't perfectly good. What would convince you of that?
If he was perfectly good, that he is
What
perfectly
would
good.
convince you that he isn't?
Oh, that he isn't.
Yes.
I would start with the resurrection. I wouldn't go to talking snakes. I wouldn't go to a dome. I would go right to the resurrection, see if Christ really rose from the dead, and then see what he said about the Old Testament and the claims of God. So no, I don't know exactly. I would widen the goalposts like Alex on this one and say
No. Firstly,
I think if God destroyed the entire human race and kept the human race dead and there were no human beings out there, well, then we wouldn't know, obviously, if he was so good or bad. But the issue, yet again, is
if he did that, would you think he's bad?
Stated, again, you are being dishonest because you just said that God tortures animals. No, God stopped the torturing of human beings. Look at Moloch, for example, and what was going on with child sacrifice. So he would be considered way better, way more good than what you are stating right here. So there's no torturing of animals.
What happened in the flood? What happened in the flood? What happened in the flood? Did they drown over 40 days and nights? Yes or no?
We don't know exactly.
I thought you weren't allowed to not know.
You don't believe the Bible.
I have no idea what that torturing supposedly looked like, or if it was a swift death.
Hold on. Why are you allowed to say you don't know?
I don't know exactly what that looks like, that type of justice. But to say that somehow people were holding little puppies in their hands and slowly killing them, I think that's a pretty weak argument.
Who said that? Who said that? Nobody said that. And also,
why am I torturing? He used the word
torturing. That doesn't
flood. No, hang on. The flood is happening over 40 days and nights. Now, in law, waterboarding, where you simulate drowning, is considered a torture. Now, this is actual drowning, done over 40 days and nights. Let's think about this. The weak would die first. The little kittens would die before the adult cats, right? This would be a slow death. It's over 40 days and nights, Stu. Now, also consider this, right? In Joshua, what does God command of the Hebrew armies? He tells them to hough their horses. Do you know what houging a horse is?
What? That's a good question. We are horse people, but you may know more about horses than me.
Okay, to hough a horse, I had to look this up when I read it, is to sever the Achilles tendon of a horse so that it can no longer run, can no longer walk. It's going to die a horrible death. And that is what God commands the Hebrew armies to do. And it's obviously why, we know why, because it's for victory in battle. Now, God could have easily taught them how to use tranquilizers. He could have teleported the horses elsewhere. He could have just put them to sleep for a few hours during the battle. But no, he commanded this torture, right? Now, if that doesn't convince you that this God is not perfectly good, what would?
Well, I just continue to rely on my favorite intellects over there where you guys are. And C.S. Lewis would answer, yes, there's a problem emotionally for me when it comes to this issue. But there's a greater problem for the atheist and agnostic in explaining this type of moral outrage they have over this issue. So we both have problems. I'm not going to say, oh, this is an easy one. And I'm not going to say this is let's just turn it into a page turner. No, there's true issues here, but I defer to C.S. Lewis, and I think Alex should as well, when saying that you still have a bigger issue than me in answering this question when it comes down to where is this ultimate moral outrage coming from? It's just your own subjective opinion.
I would like to
So
know.
why try and convince me of this with your great moral outrage?
I'm not trying to convince you as a point of morality. I'm trying to convince you of a point of the truth of the Christian doctrine. I'm making a criticism similar to what Lincoln said of slavery. If this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm not saying that it's immoral. I haven't used moralized terms. What I'm saying is that it's unexpected on the command of a loving God. C.S. Lewis, of course, has a chapter in The Problem of Pain where he discusses the suffering of animals. You know how he solves the problem? He says that they don't really experience pain. He says that they're in pain, but they don't realize it. This to me is literally a nonsensical statement. I think that actually doesn't make sense. If you want to take that line, if you want to say, well, let's defer to C.S. Lewis, look at what he says on the suffering of animals, and ask yourself if you'd be okay torturing a dog, because ultimately, although they look like they're in pain, they're not really experiencing it in the way that a human is. Also, be careful with your quotes. I mean, earlier, Stuart, you quoted Dostoevsky. You actually quoted one of the characters of Dostoevsky as saying that if God has said everything is permitted. Of course, the first place that this phrase "everything is permitted" actually occurs is in Crime and Punishment. But in this place, it's applied to the extraordinary men, in particular Napoleon, who are willing to sort of step over the moral feeling that most people have because they've given themselves a position of authority that absolves them of the general morality to commit all kinds of criminality, even though it kind of runs against people's intuitions. People like Napoleon, these great figures, are able to step over that, as Dostoevsky or Raskolnikov says. And for those people, everything is permitted. That sounds a lot more like the kind of thing that the Israelites were doing than anything that any atheist has done. Also, Dostoevsky wrote in a letter to one of his friends, and I quote, "If anyone could prove to me that Christ is outside the truth, and the truth really did exclude Christ, I should prefer to stay with Christ and not with the truth." So I agree with you that there are a great many literary greats who have assented to Christianity, but some of them do so on such ludicrous notions as diminishing the idea that animals can feel pain in the way that other human beings can, and others do so explicitly saying that they would do so even if the facts were all against them. I also want to know why it is that when I'm asked about the most fundamental basic question of reality, whether there's a God and what the ultimate meaning of life is, that when I say I don't know, you say that that's an impossible question, that I'm not allowed to have that option available to me. But when we ask you a very direct, simple textual question, do you think this actually happened and why? You're allowed to say you don't know on that much more simple question.
Oh, I don't. Much of the Old Testament, we went over this. Much of the Old Testament, you have to leave room for. Is it historical narrative, like William Lane Craig says, picking up in chapter 11 of Genesis? Or is that more metaphorical? Is that more literal? Is there poetry in Psalms, for example? You have Deborah talking about the stars are coming to fight for the Israelites. Obviously, that's a song because the next chapter afterwards, chapter 4 and 5, you have clearly that they actually fought themselves. So there was metaphor. So no, I'm not going to take any passage in the Old Testament, and especially in the New Testament, even out of Matthew, one single passage. I think it's greater evidence for reliability in one sense if many were silent on it. I'm not going to build a whole theological position off of one verse or one passage. I'm going to take many together. The Old Testament God left room for 400 years for certain people groups to turn, to change, to show love and humanitarian rights. He welcomed slave girls, prostitutes. He welcomed Canaanites into the kingdom. I mean, look at Rahab, for example, another Gentile prostitute. The type of grace and love, I went over this with you last time we talked about Genesis chapter 12, right out of the gate. He's the one who walks through the dead pieces of animals rather than saying, Abraham, you have to do it, because judgment, it's talking already about in Genesis 11, is going to land on God. That is the best form of sacrifice and love I could ever imagine. The other side is not contradicting himself, but it's showing his holiness.
Can I ask you a question? We've spoken about God inflicting suffering on animals. As it gets a bit complicated because, like you say, the genre of the text is important. There could be room for things like hyperbole, whatever. But the example that I gave in my opening, I said it was a direct question and it hasn't been answered. And that's due to the sake of time, of course. But I want to give you the opportunity now. That deer, leg trapped under a branch on its own, no moral free choice, no moral soul development, no people looking at this with a chance to save them, giving them an ability to achieve some higher order good, just starvation for, say, I don't know, a week before finally being stumbled upon by a mountain lion who will kill it by sticking its jaws in its throat, and it will die excruciatingly over the course of a few minutes. This kind of thing happens routinely throughout the animal kingdom. I've said that if I gave you the opportunity right now, if I said that you were about to become a random wild animal somewhere in the world right now, when I press this button, I think you would kill yourself before I had the opportunity, because you know that you're about to enter a life of untold misery. The question is, why? Why is this allowed? And bear in mind that I don't know is not an answer.
Oh, yes, it is an answer. I don't know is called honesty, Alex. And if I don't know,
Well, there we have it then. I agree with you. I don't know is called
I'll give
honesty.
you my best shot at it.
Agnosticism on this question is called honesty. We don't know. You don't know. I don't know.
Unfair, messed up world. That deer is not born into the Garden of Eden. And because we are born into an unfair, messed up world, I've got a bigger concern than the deer. I've got the concern of my niece who died at the age of 7 in a horrible car wreck. I have a bigger concern, Alex. I have the concern of my nephew who was born with spina bifida. I have a bigger concern, Alex, and that's my younger sister who was born with brain damage and had to go through special ed. We are all born, the deer, the human being, all of us are born into a cursed, unfair world. Not because God created it that way, but because we human beings told God to take a hike, and Lucifer told God to take a hike. And when God steps back, chaos erupts. Now, the real question is there a solution? And the amazing message of the gospel of Jesus Christ is God loves us so much that he provides the ultimate solution, forgiveness and eternal life in heaven, where there will be no more suffering, no more death. Now, what's your solution to the very real problem of animal suffering, of human suffering? And you guys, if you're going to be honest, you know you have no solution other than despair. Because poor suckers get born at the wrong time in the wrong place. It's just fate, destiny, and chance. And why don't you try and be honest about how you have to work through the despair and the meaninglessness of life in light of the fact that there is no God?
Okay, so I think you've hang on. I just want to point out something. I think you've misunderstood the problem. The problem is one of internal inconsistency, right? Either you have to bite the bullet and say the suffering of innocence is okay, or you agree it's not okay, and then you have to explain how all this suffering is allowed. Now, to the question that Cliff pointed out, and he said, well, humans told God to take a hike. Animals have been suffering for hundreds of millions of years before humans existed. The other point that you need to take account of is that evolution, mass catastrophes like the KT event that wiped out the dinosaurs, these are the engines of how we got here. So if you're going to blame it on Lucifer, if you're going to blame it on him, that makes him the author of our creation, because had these events not happened, had evolution not worked the way it did, we wouldn't be here. So these are the engines of our creation. This is why so many theists, they say we accept evolution. That's how God used, these are the means that God used to get to us. But these are incredibly violent means. So either you say Lucifer is responsible, but that means he's the author of our creation, or you have to say, well, no, it was Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, but that doesn't answer the question of hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering before.
None of this applies to animals.
Course in communication. I never said it was Lucifer's fault. I never said it was Adam and Eve's fault. I said there are consequences to created beings flipping God off and telling God to get lost. It's not the devil's fault. It's not Adam and Eve's fault. It is a consequence of created beings choosing to live their life separate from God. So I don't blame devil.
So which created beings are we talking about?
That is
which ones? Sorry, which ones are we talking
about? What
I
said.
Which ones are we talking about, Cliff? Sorry, which created beings? If it's not Lucifer, it's not Adam and Eve. Who are we talking about?
Well, obviously, there are also demons who rebelled against God, the demonic.
So it's their fault. Like Phil's question is specifically the suffering of non-human animals before Homo sapiens arrived on the scene. So say, 450,000 years ago, an animal suffering. Why? Who is it that rebelled that bring this about?
I do not know. What I do know is the consequence of free, autonomous individuals rebelling against God is chaos, unfairness, injustice fills the gap.
That comes later, because that's when humans come on the scene. But we're talking about whether we would expect to find, before humans even arrive on the scene, let alone afterwards, billions of years of suffering and death and destruction with no human beings, no Adam and Eve, no even like moral agents to do this kind of stuff. Like the only options available are that somehow these animals are responsible for rebelling against God in some way, or there's some kind of pre-human existing demons or Lucifer, in which case you would be blaming it on them, or the answer is you simply don't know, in which case sounds again like a bit of an appeal to agnosticism.
That's baloney. That's not an appeal to agnosticism. It's instead a simple, humble statement that I really don't know. And for anybody
That's what I said earlier.
that they've got all the answers to all the difficult questions is the height of human arrogance. Now,
Well, precisely.
Alex,
hold on. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
You have still not faced the impossibility of agnosticism when it comes to meaning and purpose in life, the value of a human life, ethics, and life after death. And you intentionally evade it. And I don't blame you, Alex. I'd do the same thing if I was sitting in your chair. But you still are going to have to put your head on your pillow tonight, and you're going to have to acknowledge I'm a pretty highly motivated guy. I wouldn't have gotten the education at Oxford that I have. I wouldn't work as hard as I do at being rational and logical. You are living for something. You have confidence in someone, Alex. Now, come on. Just be honest with me and tell me where your confidence, your faith is.
But that does not answer. Hang on.
I have a few things to say.
Hang on, Alex. Hang on. That doesn't answer the question, right? We asked you who was responsible. Then you said demons, and the problem that I faced,
Not say that.
the problem that I brought up is going to be exactly the same. That makes then demons the authors of our creation, because as I said, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the evolutionary process. Unless you want to deny evolution, I mean, feel free to do that if you wish. But then you're going to have more mountains of scientific evidence against you, right? So as long as you accept the scientific evidence, then these processes are how we got here. So whether you say it's Adam and Eve, whether you say it's the devil, whether you say it's demons, you're going to be faced with exactly the same problem, Cliff.
False. You have not listened carefully to me. What I have said is God created free, autonomous individuals to live in harmony, in love with him. When we rebel against him, there are consequences that we never imagined. Adam and Eve never imagined. Lucifer never imagined. I never imagined.
But before that,
I rebel against God.
Before that, animals were suffering.
There are amazing consequences that happen. And God created a good world. And when created beings rebelled against him, the consequences were horrific.
Do you know what redundancy is in design? Do you know what that phrase means?
No, I don't.
Okay, so redundancy means you plan for bad things happening. So one of my hobbies is skydiving. And if our main parachute doesn't work, guess what? We have a reserve parachute. I have a backup for my altimeter, an audible altimeter, in case that doesn't work.
Good.
Right?
I'm glad to hear that.
You build in redundancy into a system. My friend is a pilot. They have multiple backups in case things go wrong. Isn't it bad design for God to design a world that is so fragile that if a few creatures rebel, hundreds of millions, no, billions, probably trillions of animals are suffering? Isn't that bad design? Isn't that a lack of redundancy? No engineer would do that.
Also, I'm beginning to...
In order to love, we have to have a free will. If we have no free will, love is impossible. And when God creates us with a free will to love, he is obviously taking a limited risk. And the limited risk is that we will choose not to love, we will choose to hate and be apathetic. And there are horrible consequences to that. But the cross of Jesus Christ is a clear statement that God has provided the solution. God has provided the solution: forgiveness, reconciliation with him, with each other, and eternal life. And you guys are looking a gift horse in the face when you reject Christ. He's the best solution that there is to this horrible problem of animal suffering, human suffering, death of all of us. You're right. It's a real painful issue. Christ's death and resurrection is the most amazing solution to this problem. There's no better one.
And I love that you guys are taking animals so seriously. It's almost like you're appealing to this type of outrage again, but your desire to look at animals like they have souls. I mean, what is a soul? What is a self? Human beings have this. The reason why we were created in God's image, and that type of worldview spread throughout the entire world. And now all of a sudden, slaves, kids, women, people of other ethnicities, all of a sudden had worth. That came from the biblical God, no other God, definitely not atheism or anything of the sort. So I love that you guys are talking about animals and valuing them so much. But
I need to jump in here. I need to jump in here. Listen,
we
don't know.
Here in the U.S., just last point. Here in the U.S., 37% of people say that they would save the life of their dog before a stranger. Okay, that is pretty scary. And yet it's appealing to now, okay, my animal has this incredible worth. Where is this worth coming from? If they're just chemicals, if they're just a form of different fur and bones, why do I care so much? You shouldn't care. From your
hang on, very quickly. Very quickly. I know Alex wants to jump in really quick. The idea that animals have moral worth goes back to Christianity. I'm sorry, have you not heard of Jainism? They have as a simple, one of the most basic principles, no violence to living beings. Have you heard of Motzi?
Yeah, we don't
have you heard of Motzi?
Either of them. No? Just like Augustine you brought up earlier.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you're not understanding the point. Hold on. I have to speak here. I have to speak. Otherwise, I don't want to just be a potted plant, as has been said.
Sorry about that. Look, okay, one
of course,
pardon my interruption.
I'm sorry.
Okay, one moment, as I want to quickly mention, I was muted on Zoom, so Phil was not ignoring me. He just couldn't hear me. But I said just 60 seconds ago, without realizing I'm muted still, is I want to give Alex a chance to respond, and then Skyphil, and then Phil, and then we'll go into Q&A. So got about 2 minutes or so. Alex, the floor is all yours.
Look, man, this is getting kind of ludicrous. I mean, Phil just said a second ago, you said that the care about animals comes from Christianity. Phil said, have you heard of Jainism? You said, well, I don't believe in Jainism. Of course you don't believe in Jainism. What Phil is saying is not that Jainism is true. Phil is saying that Jainism already cared about animals outside of and before Christianity. That's what he's saying, undermining your claim that care for animals can only come from Christianity. Of course, you don't buy into Jainism, but it undermines the point that the care about animals can only come from Christianity because we have evidence of a world religion that believes in the care about that cares about animals without and outside of Christianity. Second point, you might not know what redundancy is in planning, but it seems like you know what redundancy is in argumentation. Every single time that Phil has brought up the point of non-human animals suffering before the fall of man, I'm going to underline that. I'm going to quote it again. I'm going to put it in bold. Before the fall of man. The answer has been, there are consequences to human creatures who rebel against God. Fine. But before that occurred, before any human being had even set foot on the planet, there were billions of years of animals suffering. This cannot be explained with reference to some mysterious consequence for some rebellious mythical human beings who apparently existed in some garden, or perhaps are a mythological representation of the first proper Homo sapiens who ever walked the planet. Billions of years before they even set foot on the planet, there was already suffering. You cannot say that that suffering is a result of a consequence of human sin. That is what has been said every single time we put this question up, but we still have not had an answer to why animals, again, underline, bold, before the original sin of human beings was suffering and dying in their brutal manners. Thirdly, earlier, and this was a while ago, Cliff said to me that I was being intellectually dishonest. He said that I was acting intellectually dishonestly, or that he sort of didn't believe what I was saying, or something like that. I may be wrong. I may be incorrect. What I'm saying may be entirely stupid, but I cannot have it said that I'm not arguing honestly here. I'm telling you what I believe, and I'm telling you what I don't know. You said, and I will quote you as best I can. I will quote you as best I can. You said that claiming to have the answer to the biggest questions of the universe is the height of intellectual arrogance. You then told me that me saying I don't know the answer to the most fundamental, foundational question of human existence is an impossible option. And that when you didn't know an answer to a question, that was called basic humility. Well, I agree with you. I agree with you. You don't know. I don't know. There are many things that we do not know. It is not me who claims to have the ultimate answer to these questions. It is you and your worldview. I cannot have it said that agnosticism is not a response, or that I'm somehow evading the questions. Tell me that I'm wrong, fine. Tell me that I'm stupid, fine. Tell me that I'm not understanding your question. Maybe I'm answering the wrong question because I've misheard you. But to say that I'm intentionally evading your question because of some kind of fault in my worldview is an attack on my character that I just can't let stand, because I strive and pride myself on my ability to honestly engage with the questions that people are answering, and honestly tell them that I don't know when I don't know. But I really, really want to hear an answer to this question of why non-human animals were suffering. One more time, I'll underline it, before any human being performed any kind of rebellious action that could have consequences on the planet.
I said so clearly. I don't
do this. I want to give you a chance to respond, Cliff, but that was my hope, was that rather than going into another question, we go into the Q&A. I can give you a really quick chance to respond, Cliff, since the question was nonetheless asked. I do want to see, Phil, if you had any last points you wanted to make. I think that you earlier wanted to say something. I'm not sure you got to.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say, Motzi was a Chinese philosopher who lived around 400 BC, and he defended a concept of universal love. So this idea that the moral concern we have for others comes from Christianity, it is just false. It is wrong.
All right, so Stuart and I got to take a course in communication because we have miscommunicated. I'm sorry for that. Alex, my whole point has been there were created beings before Adam and Eve who rebelled against God. In the first couple of verses of Genesis, you realize there was chaos and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Something was wrong before the creation of Adam and Eve. All right? So it's not an issue of it all came apart because of Adam and Eve. I think it all came apart long before Adam and Eve because created beings like Lucifer, like the demons, rebelled against God. Second point, Alex, I am not making a statement about your character. I am making a statement instead that it is impossible to be agnostic about the question of human value, human meaning, morality, and life after death because you have to live life. Because you have to live life, you have no choice. But to answer the question, the person I'm talking to, do they have value or not? Do I have value or not? You can't evade that. You have to answer that. Because how you treat that person is based on whether you view them as being valuable or not valuable. You have no choice but to figure out what's the meaning of my life. Because you have to set an agenda, a schedule for today, tomorrow, next week. And those decisions that you make about your schedule show your priorities, show your ambition in life. Thirdly, you have no choice, Alex. This is not a question of me attacking your character. It's a simple statement, Alex. You have to live life. And the way you live your life ethically shows what you believe. I'm sorry, your actions are based on thought. They're based on a worldview. That's all I'm saying, Alex. And I'm sorry, Alex, it's not an attack on your character. You have to go to funerals. And you have to decide, is there life after death or not? You cannot just say, I'm agnostic, because the dead body is there. The question is, are you going to see that person or not? So that's all I meant, Alex. This is no attack on your character. Alex, I love you. I like you. You're a great guy. I love talking with you. But agnosticism is impossible when it comes to those fundamental four issues I've pointed out to you, because you have to live life. That's all I meant.
I like you too, for what it's worth. And the only quarrel I had in terms of a character attack was saying that I was intentionally evading the question. I don't believe that that's what I was doing. Maybe I was unintentionally evading the question. Maybe I didn't understand what you were asking me. But to say that I was intentionally evading a question runs counter to the very essence of my, for want of a better word, ministry online.
I apologize for that, Alex. The reason I was so put off by you is because we've had a lot of thoughtful conversation. And when you so glibly dismissed my question of you, I'm beginning to wonder, what on earth is he doing here? Because you're a very thoughtful guy. You're a brilliant guy. No question about it, in my mind. But when I asked you that hard question and you just glibly answered it in a few sentences and then moved on, I'm thinking, good gracious, what's going on here?